Big Daddy is the 24th episode of the first season of The Golden Girls, and as always, there will be spoilers as I talk about this episode. And I quite enjoyed this one, as is usually the case, and it starts off in a way that I thought was rather entertaining as Dorothy walks into the kitchen where Sophia is. Sophia thrusts a glass towards her and tells her to taste this, and Dorothy does, and it turns out it was an expired product, which just made me think I would never trust anybody if they just told me to taste something. We then find out that there was a thunderstorm the night before, and Rose tried to get into bed with Sophia, and then Blanche comes in and reveals that her father is coming. Her father, she refers to him as Big Daddy, hence the title. And there we have our two narratives established, one revolving around Blanche and her father, and also a subplot based on the after effects of the storm. And there was at least one moment when I actually laughed out loud. I've mentioned this before, I don't really laugh out loud that often when I'm on my own watching a sitcom. So when something does make me laugh out loud, I take that as a pretty great sign, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Rose goes outside and then she beckons Dorothy and Sophia to come quick. It turns out that a tree has fallen down because of the storm. And at that moment, their neighbour also comes into their yard and sees the tree, and he says that it's their tree, even though it's very clearly a tree that was on their property. And he keeps telling them, it's your tree, it's your problem. And then the next thing we know, and this is a bit where I laughed out loud because the delivery of the line was just so fabulous. His wife comes along and says, oh my goodness, our tree fell into your yard. Basically contradicting everything her husband had just said, and I rather enjoyed that a lot. We're then back in the house a little while later. Blanche is dressed in this beautiful dress, and another moment that I rather enjoyed is when she was telling them about her father and what kind of person he is, and she says, please, please, please be on your best behaviour, and all three of them just turn to look at Sophia. It's absolutely fantastic. But what's really interesting about that is I found that actually, when somebody is visiting, Sophia is often the one who causes the least problems for the visitor. Usually it's one of the others who puts their foot in their mouth. Sophia is actually usually on her best behaviour, which I think is pretty telling about how she behaves around people she is familiar with versus how she presents herself with people she doesn't know. And I think that that's really interesting. Her father then comes over, and Dorothy's introduction to her father is really fantastic. I won't explain it all. I know I said spoilers, but long story short, she answers the door thinking it's somebody else, and it was just, again, really unexpected and something that I really enjoyed. And Blanche's father is certainly a very interesting character. He's played by Murray Hamilton, and things don't necessarily go according to plan because he reveals to Blanche that actually he's going to be singing, and he's really excited about this. He invites everybody down to the show, but Blanche thinks he's going to make a fool of himself, and he tries to convince her otherwise, but she's definitely not convinced, and she says at one point this brilliant quote that I loved: he's lost the stuffing out of his comforter, which I just thought was absolutely fantastic. Very, very well written episode. The way Blanche speaks in this is really great. It's one of those situations where when you're with somebody from your home, your speech patterns change, and this is what we see with Blanche, and I really thoroughly enjoyed that. However, not everything Blanche said was great, because she confronts her father to basically tell him he shouldn't be singing, which in itself is not great, but then he plays the guitar and sings for her, and yeah, he's maybe not the best singer, but Blanche was so unsupportive. She said, at your age, just out of nowhere, as if it's not possible to discover a new hobby or interest later in life, which is ridiculous. And she even said to him to forget about all this nonsense, which is really dismissive of his feelings and what he's looking for at this stage in his life. So Blanche wasn't necessarily behaving very admirably. And then she found out that her father sold the house to achieve this. He needed money to go on the road. And at that point, I thought, okay, maybe the talk could have been beneficial, but Blanche said all of these things before he revealed that. And obviously, if somebody's going to sell their house to follow a dream that might never happen, it is a big risk. With things getting quite heated and serious, we take a break from that so Rose can tell a story about her father and tuna and a parade. And it was a delightful story and a nice break from things being a bit more serious. I think the balance there was perfect. But then Blanche reveals that the real reason this is bothering her is because she's reached a stage in her life where her father is no longer the one looking after her. She now needs to look after her father and worry about him and care about him. Well, she always cared about him, but to care for him in ways that perhaps she wasn't previously. And I think that that's a really important topic. It doesn't focus on it too much, but the shifting dynamics between parent and child is something that most people will face at some point. And I think it did a good job to briefly touch on that. They do end up going down to see her father performing, and unfortunately her father was only doing one set because they didn't like him. He wasn't very good, so they didn't actually get to see him singing because he wasn't doing the second performance. And we then have a really beautiful and kind of emotional discussion because her father explains the motivation behind this sudden shift in his life, and he explains that now that his wife has passed away, he's just rattling around in this house on his own. And he also knows when you lose somebody, you start to question your own mortality, and that made him realise that his time is limited, so he should go and have the big adventure he always dreamed of. And I think that that's actually a really great thing because he's getting away from where the pain obviously is and exploring the world and doing something that he's always wanted to do. And it seems like a very healthy response. So even though Blanche kind of saw him initially as, well, as she said, losing the stuffing out of his comforter, actually, it seems like he was doing a very healthy thing. And I think that that was a really nice way to conclude the episode. And as I said, quite emotional and very moving as well. So definitely a decent episode with some really great points raised. Enough comedy in it that it's still quite lighthearted, but with some more serious issues addressed as well. Big Daddy is a pretty great penultimate episode for the first season. Looking forward to watching the final episode of this season, and definitely is an episode that I'm happy to recommend if you haven't seen it.